Thomas Chocken, our
Good to be
newest
here.
addition. Good to see you again, Thomas. We hope that we get as good a turnout as last time. But the topic again is Plato on beauty and virtue, which is the topic of your course. If people have any questions for Thomas, please let us know in the chat and we'll get to them either in the end or whenever they make sense. If you know anyone who's interested in Plato, by the way, just maybe share the link to the live stream with them. So, Thomas, it's good to be with you again. Please introduce yourself to the world, to
Yeah,
all
for real.
15 listeners, and the hundreds more who will come later on. And of
100%. Yeah.
course, also your course. Go on.
Yes. Yes. I mean, listen, it's about the quality of the persons here. That's what counts more than the numbers. But with that said, yeah, I'm a designer from a design background. I met Johannes from his courses in the past. I took his pre-Socratic as well as his Heidegger course, and and I've been teaching in the design field industry for about 10 years at this point. So I taught at the major design schools in New York City, Pratt Institute, at Fashion Institute of Technology, the City College of New York, various campuses there. I'm an alumnus of Parsons School of Design and the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Art and Science. My most current teaching engagement was at the University of North Georgia in the visual art department.
Yeah.
So I've been teaching for a very long time, and an area I've had very much a lot of interest in is on the discussion of beauty. Not as we talked about in our last live stream together, not aesthetics per se, but beauty, and seeing
Yeah.
the distinction of the two. So when you approached me to teach a course at the Halcyon Guild, and I was very honored for that 2 years ago, a year and a half, 2 years ago. The
One and a half.
topic, yes,
One and a half. One and a half.
one and a half. You can round up.
Yeah.
Um, it feels like 2 years. It was quite the endeavor. Um, Basically, it was on the. I originally came with you just on beauty as a large topic, and then over time we narrowed it down uh, to just Plato's dialogues about beauty, which
Yeah.
is really important for me because my background or interest in philosophy came from Aristotle. So as an Aristotelian, looking back to Plato, I found it very rewarding to just focus on his texts about the beautiful. And through that process, and it was uncovered that this topic of the beautiful is a very common instrument used by Plato in a large number of his dialogues. And not just on just simple things we would think as aesthetics or physical
Yeah.
appearance, but on his entire accounts of epistemology, ontology, and ethics all correspond or have articulations through his topic or discussion of the beautiful. So it was a very rewarding process for me to go through those dialogues and to develop this course, uh, where it's 6 dialogues with the introduction essay at the beginning, where I set up the nature of our questions we're asking. Why are we investigating the beautiful? I think fundamentally the question comes down to, and I deal with teaching my students, is that a lot of students come into the arts thinking this is self-expression or aesthetic or just pleasure experience that is
Yeah.
just subjective. But
Yeah.
through a serious investigation of the beautiful, you realize that there is a very different account that Plato presents, Aristotle actually maintains and continues it, in my opinion, um,
Yeah.
and it's a radically different approach from what we normally think of the aesthetic experience in general.
Yeah.
So that's just for me a very rewarding process. And also through that discussion of the beautiful, you find out that a lot of Plato's other major ideas, idea of the good,
Mm.
because the nature of truth, are actually articulated through the beautiful. You find that out through reading these dialogues, the ones I've
Yeah.
selected to work with.
Yeah. And that the forms are visible in beauty. That beauty is this medium where the invisible and the visible meet.
That's exactly it. Yes, that it's true for anyone who has any kind of questions of epistemology. But it's much more than that. But that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
That what is the connection of the unseen but intelligible, and the sense experience? What is the connection? And you realize through these dialogues in Plato, he's relying a lot on the beautiful to hold this off, to justify it. There's some other nice, interesting dynamics too. The nature of the soul, for example. Uh, through these dialogues, understand that how that works, the mechanism, but it's very coherent. But it's only really coherent if you have investigation of the beautiful. It makes sense what Plato's argument is, or presentation is,
Mm.
through this discussion of the topic of the beautiful.
Yeah. But as you mentioned, self-expression and our modern contemporary understanding, do you know either historically or genealogically, etc., um, or maybe even more philosophically, where this notion comes from that art is self-expression, which it very often now is when we look at modern or contemporary artworks, that it is expression of lived experience, etc.
It depends on which framework. Yeah, it depends which kind of framework you want to pick from. So, from a fine art perspective, uh, generally things like abstract expressionism would be one lynch point. So, the idea of not of the art making process not being a mimetic reproduction of simulacrum, right? A basic of similarity to external reality and representation of it, but instead through a kind of spiritual language. Actually, the language a lot from like Kandinsky, for example, in the early 20th century, 1900s, around that time period, of the spiritual experience of art through the representation of geometric presentation. That is through and articulated through the expression of that geometric composition and presentation.
Mm.
That'd be one line of argument you can point out. You could point to Hume, for example, for some of these reference points to have taste. We brought this up a
Yeah.
little bit in the last live stream together. Um, I think also the general idea of a kind of collapse of the good with the beautiful is a very common phenomenon that gets played out a lot. We can see
Yeah.
that articulation through. But I think in the fine art, and also in the fine arts, especially besides the kind of abstract expressionist chain of modernism, that kind of argumentation of self-expression through the making of the artist's spiritual expression through non-representational art making, is the other side of kind of the Dadaist or the kind of almost the via negativa approach of the art concept being destroyed. So the mode of self-expression is one of denial, of resistance, or challenging of norms and expectations. So there's kind of an implication that the artist's kind of individuality is the act of
Mm.
the expression is by rejection of norms or social conventions. A lot of that has to do with the academic formalism of art that came up in France, for example, around. We see these examples in the Impressionist period, for example, post-Impressionist period, where these
Yeah.
were generally artists that were rejected from the academic art making professions and academies and the salons, for example. And it was generally through secondary markers or secondary channels that these artists articulated their artistic vision. Um, so those in the fine art tradition. This is art history. We can talk about in these on these properties, but generally it's usually for example, like Hume was a much earlier period. So it's always
Yeah.
interesting in the arts. Generally, there are symptoms of changes in thought or belief that's occurred in prior centuries or prior time.
Mm. Even so, I'll just say this very briefly, but so this challenging of norms, etc., is of course itself normative and generates its own normativity and etc., etc. So okay, but we are returning to the beautiful in a different sense, so then the aesthetic sense or the aesthetical sense. Maybe I so as you pointed out, beauty is to be found everywhere if we want to have all the sort of subfields and Platonic thought as we now are accustomed to distinguishing in philosophy between epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, etc. Um, but beauty is, to make it simple, there's an ontological beauty in Plato. Um, you don't have to use quite that language if you don't want to, but how would you distinguish, just for anyone listening, what how aesthetical perception of beauty and the Platonic beauty in the true full sense of the word? And by the way, if anyone has questions for Thomas, let us know in the chat. We'll get to them in the end.
That's a good question. Well, first things in the kind of articulation. So the first point, so the way we're going to review these dialogues, we start with just greater Hippias, which I've always felt like I've always was kind of when I first encountered greater Hippias, I was very upset I never encountered it earlier in my education in arts and design, because that is where the Plato has Socrates discuss with Hippias point blank what is the beautiful. There's a kind of a definitional investigation. What is this thing called the beautiful? And in there, there's actually a kind of we see the setup where this is a discussion about what Plato means by the forms, because by the just are just, by the good are good. So it's he's making it very clear. The setup is this is
Mm,
discussion of the forms in the way of almost of basically predication that things have these the predicates applied to them by this thing, these entities or objects called the
mm,
good, the just, the beautiful. It goes into an aporia failure where they can't come to a conclusion in Greater Hippias. Yes, in
yeah.
Greater Hippias. But then after a discussion, I kind of interlude into love and its relationship. So one of the questions of the aesthetic experience versus the ontological is a question of the beloved and the lover. So that's one of the first arguments made there. And is in Symposium and in Phaedrus. That's the initial point. And then we start Symposium discussion of the doctrine of love, so the beloved and the beloved, the lover and the beloved. Then we go into Phaedrus to continue that with some supplemental points onto an ontological point. So one of the things that's really fascinating in because the character Socrates gives two speeches in Phaedrus. Obviously, I think it's pretty. The first one looks facetious and incorrect and massively incorrect. He does a second speech later, but in that first one, it's really interesting. He has a discussion of um, excess as predication. So the idea of predication, things have these predicates applied to them. A drunkard by their excessive desire. So the idea of the drunkard has an excessive desire for drink, the glutton for food, and a lover is an excessive desire for their beloved. So there's actually this relationship of uh, eros of desire for the lover of their beloved, and that kind of excess of it
Yeah.
driving almost predication through that. So normally, the idea of subject and predicates like a linguistic object discussion. Right there in this presentation, we're seeing that there's an overlap of of the ontological status of predication uh, by that just one demonstration. And then drawing out in Phaedrus, there's a whole line. Now it's presented in the kind of mythos mode of the chariot with the two horses. There's a whole discussion about that. But it's said very clearly that when a human soul
Yeah.
perceives the ousia ontos ousia, there's a there is am I going? Johannes, are you there?
Always there.
Okay, just making sure. I panicked for a second because the screen went away. Um, okay, with that said, the idea that there's the ontos ousia ontos, like kind of the
Hmm.
real true reality. It's the beautiful. Like that is what is perceived at the apprehension of the
Yeah.
soul in heaven in the afterlife that they see this. Uh, so thus, and it's basically there's an idea of like everything after that. It's this connection of the idea of recollection is built up from that. So finishing in Phaedrus, there's this whole point of the modes of mania. And one of them, the fourth one, is the recollection of the beautiful.
Yeah.
So what's happened is that when on the mortal realm, when one is struck by beauty and fall in love with it in the material reality, it's a
Yeah.
recollection. That's the argument being made of this highest reality, and
Mhm.
it appears to be a madness from the outside, but it's actually the most true reality. So thus we see that for Plato, there's a really, and I talk about this in the introduction, it is certainly not just a generic Platonism of extreme rationality, and that it's all in the mind, and there's absolutely no contact to external reality of sensation, of perception. Uh, these accounts are really showing there's a much more sophisticated process going on
Yeah.
in Plato's dialogues, using the discussion of the beautiful.
I, as you know, I taught a course. Sorry, I just have to let the world know we're live. Uh, so I taught the Politeia earlier this year, and I remember reading it for the 500th time, I think about 4 years ago. And during that reading, especially in English, the word justice is really not the greatest translation for dikaiosune. Given the many connotations that we have with the word justice today, but also with what dikaiosune implies, which is also it's not a legalistic term. It's not so much purely moral at all. It's also more about a coming together or an evening out of that which is at odds, but then is being brought into harmony. So, and this is it's the dialectical play. So one possible translation, which is also not the best, perhaps, would be appropriateness, because again, that in especially in British English, it has a very terrible connotation. So this is not appropriate, young man.
Yeah.
What are you doing here? But appropriateness, we hear in it the Latin word proprium, that which is own, to own most to something. Um, so the soul must be balanced out, as must the polis be balanced out. Then dikaiosune comes about, and I think it's very important always also in Plato, because in Platonism everything is static and the eternal ideas, but there's always a coming about. There's beauty shows itself, and there's not something does not show itself. You're not guaranteed the insight into the idea of the good. It's not given. It has to be wrested free. So and I think, especially when I listen to your lectures again, that you were basically circling around a similar understanding of justice.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Then
No,
I heard
that's
that
exactly it.
right.
Yes, it's a kind of no, no. That's why I love. See, that's why that's what's so important, because it's actually very important what you just said there. Because so one, there are some examples like in Greater Hippias. There's this really powerful tension point
Yeah,
where it's presented that the beautiful is not the like. There's a superiority of the beautiful over the good. It's a really high tension point for anyone who reads Plato. And generally, if your impression is just the Republic about that, that's an incredibly tension point. But what you're pointing out is when we actually read politics and it's the Republic in its real sense, um, you kind of realize a very similar, exactly. Like there's this idea of the fittingness. Which is brought up in Greater Hippias. So one of the proposals of what is the beautiful is the fitting. It's found not to be like it's not enough to cover it, but it's certainly a very strong area of discussion there. Um, and I talk about that in my essay response, like in my commentary, like thinking with it, um, where I comment that this is related to the idea of function, of things that are with basically arete, right, with excellence, to the actuality of the function, right, of the activity of the thing. So that language, you could see the overlap between the two there, and that relates to, very importantly, overall the kind of attitude that the human soul needs to be shapen. So there's a whole, like, in Phaedrus is the whole presentation of the rhetorician, dialectic rhetorician, who has the doctor of the soul and to shape the soul to desire the best, right, through devotion and training. Uh, so that and then from Phaedrus too, this is hierarchy of the gods, of which god that one honors or finds love with shapes the soul. Really, we're we dress ourselves. We are shaped by that divine intervention of which level we choose to relate to with our devotion of love. So yes, I would absolutely agree. Like I find that's one of the conclusions reading these dialogues is you
yeah,
find out that there's a kind of what one finds their beloved and one finds beautiful is a mark of your character and defining of who you are. Uh, so that is a very powerful, I think, actually, and that's the thing is that leads to justice being an ontological stance too, kind of the fittingness of
yeah,
how we respond to the conditions of our lives and experiences and our relationships to other people.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's that distinguishes a reading of these dialogues from pure, merely taking in informational values. Because then what you're fighting about is definitions of justice, etc. And other such nonsense that has nothing to do with thinking. But anyways, so let me perhaps now say again that we have a few more people here. If you have questions for Thomas on Plato, on beauty and virtue, on the course in general, or more specifically on Plato, etc., put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them either when they fit in or when they make sense, or at the end. But we'll get to all of them as long as they are within the realm of decency. And if you want to enroll, please do so by following the link in the description of this live stream, or also the link which is in the chat here. I'll show you the enrollment page and go over a few things now. This is the enrollment page. It's a partner called Teachable, which is a great platform to use. I'll show you what the course looks like on the inside in a second. Now, seminars for this one begin on July 27th. That means we've got about a month until the course begins. Seminar dates are 5 consecutive Saturdays, always from 6 to 8 p.m. UK time, which is 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which is where Thomas also is. So if you're in America, I think this is a good compromise for everyone. I think almost everyone can make it from all time zones, including we've had people from South Africa joining in, etc. So and from Mexico, so that should work. You find all seminar dates listed here, and we're going back to Thomas's wise words in a second. Just let me point out that if you don't have time for the seminars, you still like to learn on Plato and beauty, you get access to 7 exclusive videos with the self-study tier. You learn at your own pace. There's indefinite access or lifetime access. So there's no need to join the seminars if you don't have time for them. But if you'd like to join, I think if you can make at least 3 seminars, then the philosophical fellowship is for you. Live seminar discussions. There will be 5 Zoom seminars. The final seminar, the 5th one, is where you can present. So there'll be a conference where you can present your own either academic talk or a poem, an essay, anything that you've written that was inspired by the course. We record all seminars for the group. So if you can't make it to any of the seminars, they will be recorded. You will have access to them indefinitely as well through Teachable. So you don't lose out. There will be a course forum as well on Discord. So that allows you to stay in touch with your peers and maybe start a reading group, etc. While we're not meeting during the week. If you want to take Thomas, by the way, feel free to add anything you'd like to add afterwards on the seminars or also on the private dialogue sessions. If you want to discuss even more closely with Thomas on Plato, if you have burning questions on Plato, maybe you're working on something that has to do with beauty or the arts, etc., then the philosophical dialogues are right for you. 5 private tutorials with Thomas Jock, in addition to anything and everything from lower tiers. There's also a payment plan right here. So if you click on the enrollment page, you can take a look at the curriculum. All the materials have been uploaded, so you can start listening and reading straight away. And the introduction video is public here. There's a summary of Thomas as well, if you'd like to look at what he's been up to. So, okay, there are a couple of questions already, but now back to you, Thomas.
Yeah. No, I'm very excited about the course, and I think especially I'm very excited about the pro seminar and the conference at the end, especially because I did those courses. I did 2 of them, and I found the just being in a room with other like-minded individuals with prompts to chew on and think about really aided my understanding of the text I had to read. I made some great friends there. So, for example, Daniel Gardner of OG Rose and Javier Rivera, I met through your early pre-Socratic course, and we wrote our book together, right? So philosophy of
Really?
differences came from that encounter.
I
Uh,
didn't know that.
yeah, yeah.
That's cool.
So great philosophical developments came from that. Came from coming to these pro seminars and conference groups.
Yeah,
Um, so I think that's a reward within itself. Let alone I think especially under a topic like the beautiful
yeah,
and virtue. I think these are just well springs of people that are interested in these kind of questions are going to be very uh, pre-selected, interesting people, because the fact that you think this is worth your investigation and time
yeah,
pre-selects or indicates something very special about you.
yeah,
Yeah, that's not my argument. That's Plato's argument. As I just said prior to the walkthrough,
yeah,
uh,
yeah,
you
yeah.
are defined by what one loves.
Excellent. Um, so maybe tell people a bit more what specifically the seminars will look like. Not so much the content, but how you structure them, how you go about. I mean, you've got a decade of teaching experience,
Yeah.
so there's nothing I can teach you when it comes to teaching. But y- what do you foresee? How will you structure it? What will happen, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously, the mark of a great teacher is their ability to. It's actually I'm very sympathetic to what was presented in Phaedrus of the rhetorician as the doctor of the soul, because it's very teaching when done. We talked off record about this, like before we started recording today. Teaching done well is very demanding. It's a kind of receptivity of the student, and especially when it's a group of students, you have to do that both as a collective. You have to like feel the room. Any good teacher knows how to project their voice, shoot it through the room. Actually, one of my favorite techniques in teaching would be like if someone I had to speak to someone that's say in the back of a room, I would shoot my voice not through the people in the front, but over them. I don't know how to articulate that, but you're
Yeah,
able
yeah,
to shoot the voice, not because you don't want to hurt the people right in the right front row because it's not you're trying to talk to someone behind them. So you kind of like ballistically shoot your voice over the first group of people to get to the back of the room. Might be like 30 feet away. Uh, so power projection of voice, being able to ballistically shoot your voice where needed, but also just be able to respond on the fly. Like you can't like I mentor people who in education all the time, and I tell them you have a loose outline of what you're going to talk about. Have like hit your notes, like what you're going to hit, but be prepared to respond to what the students give you in terms of how do they respond. Your job, I always think of actually from a boxing metaphor from Customato, the trainer of Mike Tyson. Um,
yeah,
what he does is he first, put some sparks in on the logs. And then once the fire goes, then you can't cause the fire, but you can help initiate it. And then once the fire goes, you start throwing logs in to help aid it and support it. So as a teaching methodology, you have to be very responsive to to the particulars of the person in front of you, whether it be a group of students or any one student individually. The way you do that normally is, for example, there'll be two prompts. So when it happens, you come in, I'll be kind of riffing, meditating on the dialogue of the week or two. Uh, I wrote these a year and a half ago, and I know I'll roughly reread it again, both the
yeah,
original dialogue and my commentary, and I'll riff
yeah,
on it just on my understanding of it now for a few minutes. There'll be a prompt. You'll be put into Zoom breakout rooms to discuss that prompt, and when you come back, we'll share as a group the responses to that prompt, and that's what I mean.
yeah,
Like I can't control that what you guys are all going to say, and I think it's very rewarding though because then from that response, there's a kind of you kind of work with that fire that's given back to you. Those sparks become a fire, a little little embers, and then you just kind of run with the embers and you draw it out to come to new understanding, and then you do it again a second time. So ideally, when done well, you're going to leave the students will leave the room, will leave the Zoom session with a kind of buzzing in the mind of like insight and understanding and questions. I think I've done it actually from your classes, Hans, when I was a student with you. Um, there'd be sessions where I would come out with like questions, like they'd be almost like this driving passion of like, I have this question, I have to go pursue it. It becomes like a hunt almost at that point. Um,
and then you
it's
wrote a
quite,
book.
quite lovely. What's that?
And then he wrote a book.
Well, exactly. Yeah,
I didn't
yeah,
know that. That's very.
yeah.
Uh, so here's one. It doesn't really fit, but to get it started, is aesthetic intuition noetic? Asks Soul Invictus.
Yes. Um,
Fascinating name.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, if you mean by aesthetic intuition, the encounter of the beautiful, I would probably, if you mean that the response of Noose, so initial apprehension, yeah, I think so. I mean, that's me being more versatilian in flavor to because I'm using from Nicomachean Ethics the discussion of Noose is discussed there.
Yeah.
So I'm using that lens to answer that question. So I have to first take that aesthetic intuition, grab it, and then convert that to mean we mean the encounter of the beautiful. Uh, if we mean by that the what is operating to apprehend it, it's Noose. I would say so from my reading, but it requires some take some more clarity to understand what Sol Invictus meant by that.
Yeah, feel free to say a bit more. Here's another one. I don't know. Can you tell me about Apollo? Well, that's not a very specific question.
If he means like, because there is a reference to him in Phaedrus, so the
Many
idea
references.
of the
Yeah, yeah.
inspiration by the gods, the muses for the poets. I think it's Stephen. I think it's prophecies Apollo, uh, muses for poetry, Dionysus for madness. But
Yeah.
then the thing is, for the best divine inspiration is with Eros and Aphrodite of for basically that fourth mode of mania. So it's basically each encounter of the manias has a god associated with it. So if he meant in that context and sense, that'd be one way to talk about it. Um,
Yeah, Apollo is also referenced throughout the Politeia, for example, very explicitly by Socrates, that Apollo is the highest god in charge of anything that matters, all ceremonies, cemeteries, so burying the dead, etc. And there shall be no other god is one translation by Jowett, for example. So that is also very striking and something to be considered. Don't think it has been considered enough how often really Plato does refer to the gods in general, and not just the demiurge, which is mentioned in the Timaeus only. Memnosine, for example, the mother of the Muses, mentions explicitly at the beginning of the Cretius dialogue, which is the origin myth that Plato provides for Athens, um, in its eternal battle with Atlantis. Uh, but yeah, so that's something. So you'll find many passages, really, if you're interested in this, Mr. Bogtrotter, on Apollo and in on Apollo in Plato. That would be my 2 cents. Okay, Thomas, feel free to continue. If anyone else has any more questions specifically on Plato, um, and beauty, then please let us know in the chat.
yeah, I think. Well, let's see. So we were talking before about teaching, right, and the
Yeah,
idea of yeah, and actually, you know, in Phaedrus is a very important, and this is the connection. Basically, what we do is we kind of have a little interlude with Meno a little bit, but there's a nature of written words versus the living word. There's a very interesting line in Phaedrus about that. The idea that written words are not necessarily guarantees of knowledge. Um, so the idea of this is why I love the proseminar because this idea of the act of speech, right, living speech, is very important in the give and take of dialectic rhetorician engagement. I think is very important, and I think part of Plato's presentation in Phaedrus and in Cratylus. So Cratylus is where a very systematic approach of the nature of names is presented, which
hmm.
is presenting the doctrine of images, or the question of the nature of the images to reality is presented. So this is why I'm a very big proponent of the proseminar. I think obviously there's a lot of value even just from the recordings, right? At your own time you can learn from that.
Yeah.
But the proseminar adds a really an exponential level of engagement and benefit. And I think Plato would agree with that from the way he's presenting things like in Phaedrus and in Cratylus.
So let me perhaps show people quickly what this looks like on the inside. Everyone who's listening, either now or later on, enrollment is now open. So follow the link and join the course if you're interested in Plato, Greek philosophy in general. What Thomas has put together is focusing on beauty, yes, but it is also going to give you a deep uh, insight into and paths into Plato and Plato's philosophy, as reading so many different dialogues, very focused, but still, will if you consider one aspect in Plato, because it is ultimately what we would call systematic philosophy, so everything hangs together with everything else, everything is related to everything else, you will be going away from this course with a sounder understanding and insight into Plato and not Platonism. So, but that's maybe something to discuss at the course, what we mean by that, or maybe we should discuss this here in a bit. So, if you what you see here is the introductory lecture. Let's see. So it's going to autoplay, I guess. Yes, it does. I can click on pause. It's already on mute. So here's Thomas lecturing. There is an MP3 file as well if you'd rather listen than watch. The handout is downloadable as a PDF. You can print it off, obviously. And they're all reading sections are listed here. So you can see that this is what you're supposed to read for that section, for that seminar. And complete and continue. So look at the second one or the first one. Hi, everybody. Autoplay again. Yeah, so that's what it looks like on the inside. Once you're enrolled, you have immediate access to all the materials already now. So we're only beginning in a month, but you could start listening and reading now, so you can come really well prepared. So we wanted to open enrollment early to give you all an opportunity to read and listen up. So Soul Invictus says, by the way, if there are more questions, yes, I do. It's too long. Sorry. I'm going to read it. Yes, I do mean the encounter with the beautiful. From my own experience, that initial encounter seems to be oblivious and indubitable. No, it's obvious. Sorry.
Obvious.
Yeah. As in, you really think that you have encountered something. And then I think this is go on. Yeah.
Well, no, just let's do it. Well, yeah, you can finish the statement and I'll get a reply.
Beautiful and don't something beautiful and don't need a justification for its beauty. That directness, but also rationality of knowledge seems to be what Noose is really about. Thanks for the answer.
So 2 parts. Part 1 is this is why I went to the kind of Aristotelian definition of nous. I went right to that because that's exactly the point. Nous is that kind of operation of intuitive knowledge, right? That it's just awareness, basically. Like it's the first kind of build on a little bit of scholasticism, right? That the 3 acts of the intellect is the apprehension, the judgment, and then the reasoning. So there needs to be a first apprehension of X is in front of me, whatever this is. And then next comes a judgment of that apprehension. And truth, this is very important, truth under the correspondence theory is about judgments. So the idea of this in front of me is a dog is the conjunction of the subject predicate with is. That's an act of judgment. So the truth value of the propositions operates on the judgment operation junction. What's interesting is that actually with propositions, the whole value argument about it is that through a chaining of propositions through specific figures, you can come to new understandings, right? That thus the act of reasoning gives you new apprehensions through the reasoning. But with that said, the initial act of apprehension is through nous, which from a theological point of view, theological accounts would argue that's a divine intervention or divine operation that's occurring. Well, on a more even on a philosophical point of view from Aristotle, it's this part of the intellect that operates on first apprehension, which corresponds with beauty. Now with that, so as I just hinted at before, I met Daniel Gardner from OG Rose and Michelle Gardner from OG Rose, as well as Javier. The 3 of us have been, I kind of joked, we've been part of the, one of my major interest projects was on lack. So lack is phrases. There's a really fun line. I mean, one of my favorite lines, it's super subtle from Greater Hippias. It's at the very end where they're working through what is beauty. And one of the things they close with is the nature of perception and hearing. So something can be beautiful in sight and beautiful in hearing. And the argument, the character Socrates is hustling Hippias to say, well, wait a minute, which one, is it in both or is it in neither? It's a really interesting line about, or is it, if it's in one but not the other, perhaps the question maybe better said is it's beautiful by what's lacking about it, and both. It's very curious. So the stasis, this kind of lack, is a really topic I found much interest in. Well, it's in Aristotle as well. Um, Basically, things are operations of form, matter, and lack. So lack is actually it's considered one of the things that creates things coming to be in the first place. I found that very interesting from Aristotle's account in Metaphysics and Physics. Um, but with that also is that there's a discussion that beauty and lack have these kind of relationships to each other. So that's discussed in the philosophy of glimpses and in other writings from the Gardeners, from Javier, and in myself. This is an area of a lot of interest for us because basically what Solus Invictus was saying is that there's this kind of indubitable, obvious point of when we encounter beauty, there's this kind of almost this presupposition built in that something's more than what's present to us is occurring. Uh,
Mm.
the Gardeners kind of work with that to kind of make an argument that means that it shows that we're not just individual subjects. There's a kind of interpenetration uh, of the beautiful onto us. It actually gives us indubitable confidence of the external reality. As an example, I'm paraphrasing the Gardener's arguments being
Yeah, yeah.
made, but the point is that uh, this is a very live philosophical project that I myself and other individuals have found really interesting. And beauty has a very important role to play, specifically the beautiful, in a lot of this in the R investigations.
That's what Kant says, by the way, also in the so-called third critique, the critique of judgment. Precisely this on beautiful. I wonder though, when you speak of lack, would it make sense also to speak of what is not available? What is non-available, unavailable, not availing itself, not making. You see, because when we speak of lack, then it seems that there's something that is lacking. But what is when we speak of unavailability and the non-available or the withdrawal, then perhaps that's ontological rather than ontic.
Mhm. Yeah, that's the kind of teasing out of this. Um, the way I try to talk about this a lot is
Yeah.
there's a very the collapse of lack to nothing is uh, it's sometimes unwarranted or not reasonable because the
Hmm.
point of usually when we collapse a lack to a nothing,
Yeah.
it's a collapsing because it's saying that it's cutting off possibility. That's why that unavailability part is a really interesting kind of teasing out a little bit because because this term is purposely it is absolutely has equivocal properties to it in the sense of like what would we mean by this? There's a difference between what's not yet, because that's the
Yeah.
thing Aristotle talks about this. Like lack can mean basically things like not yet. So when a young basic beginning of children or beginning of
Dynamis.
a person, a child can't do is lacking that because it's not yet. They haven't developed it yet. Versus someone that's older and is infertile, for example.
Yeah, yeah. But that's potential also, isn't it? Then the
Yes,
dynamis.
see, that's exactly it. See, yes,
To I mean, Aristotle is so beautiful. Tito on enai, and they translate Tito on enai as formal cause in the Loeb translation. Formal cause. That's horrendous. Tito on enai is that which was being, and or that which it meant to be. To be. Enai is the verbal form. It's and that I think relates also to actuality, of course, and to potentiality, etc. But just as a
yes, yes,
we shouldn't discuss too much
yeah,
about
yes, yeah, yeah.
Aristotle.
Please
But
bring me on. Please bring me in for that. Bring me into that class. Bring me
well,
into
yeah,
that talk. I love
it
that
has to
topic.
happen at some point. Yeah, it has to happen at some point.
Yes, because
Yeah.
what we're
Aristotle.
bringing up is that kind of interpenetration. It's this kind of like this kind of intermixing interpenetration of these dichotomous relationships that seem to be because traditionally the potential actuals is like this hard line break.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
one or the other. But that's the point. Like you really tease out these concepts and terms. Some of my favorite points about that
You
is
know, you know.
oh, go
Sorry, go on. Yeah, I have to stop myself. I have to. This is the best thing about this technology. I can mute myself,
on.
and then I can't interrupt people anymore. So go on.
Oh no, I was just saying that is it metaphysics or is it in physics? I forgot which one it is. But there's a discuss. Oh, it's physics. No, it's metaphysics. I remember this. So there's a discussion of the brazen, basically like the word it gets translated for us in English, like brazen, wooden, that end. Basically, the term that end
Yeah.
is it's used by Aristotle.
Yeah.
What he's bringing up is in that sense. So where does this a wood, basically the brazen spear, like a spear that is that's made of bronze? Where did that brazen spear come from? Aristotle is incredibly emphatic. You cannot say it came from the bronze, meaning like it came springing forth of the material object, the
Yeah.
matter, straight up. He says it came from the lac, it came from the straces, and that's kind of thunder shocking when I read that because it's such a
Yeah.
powerful. I think that's such a fascinating articulation. Uh,
Yeah. So negativity or the nothing, if you want to use that word, is very strong in the so-called Western tradition. And I think sometimes I have the feeling, that's what I wanted to say, is I have the feeling, that sounds horrible. Uh, I have the suspicion, almost. No, I have the very clear. Um, it's not a suspicion. I actually really fully and strongly believe that we are almost reading all these texts now for the first time. This sounds ridiculously arrogant, and I don't mean to um, denigrate Leibniz, or who wanted to resurrect, as it were, entelechia, entelchi, or obviously the great Aquinas, etc. But we are in a way so removed from all tradition and so fallen out from all of, be it the biblical tradition, the Christian tradition, or whatever, or the philosophical tradition, that we are at the same time, for the maybe really for the first time, also because we have all the texts available. That's the next.
yeah, that's a big one.
And they're so available now, which also has its downsides, because speaking of lack and over, if you have too much of of something, it can also actually be a strange form of lack.
Yeah, the kind of
um, having
excess. Yes.
having something available doesn't mean that you have understood it. Just because there's a Wikipedia entry and summary of everything doesn't mean that anyone's understood it or read it. But in fact, because the way you describe Plato, and there's this one line here, and there's one line, and actually, when you read Aristotle, it's not, to make it simple for listeners, it's not schematic, it's not potentiality, actuality, boom, 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 back and forth, or just from one to the other. It's there's complexity to it that was underappreciated, um, I think, or maybe it wasn't even necessary, because it didn't. But we didn't. Perhaps the tradition very often didn't pick up on what was also said in the texts, and now that we're fallen out of tradition, in a sense, we're for the first time almost encountering all of these, and we can read them, not as, I have to defend Aristotle because he's the philosopher, to quote Aquinas, or I have to defend this one because he is the Christian theologian. I have to defend the Holy Church forevermore. Uh, so there's something about this time where we're at once disconnected from the tradition, but also strangely able to reappropriate it in a way, or letting ourselves be appropriated by it,
Yeah.
because we can read Plato not as a Platonist, so we can, or Aristotle not as Aristotelian, say, well, that's something that no one has picked up on. Um, for example, what does toti and enai mean? This alone could fill libraries. If we just translate it as formal cause, I think we lose something. Also, with the hypokeimenon, I have one short video on this, which is not important now, but um, the hypokeimenon, which is then translated as substance, etc. That could be something else too. But to bring this back to Plato and beauty, this, of course, now what's fascinated and enthralled people for centuries, millennia even, are the forms. Is where are they? Where's this heaven above the heavens, to use even Plato's metaphorical or mythological language. Um, But what comes out in your reading is that what we can translate as the form or a die, it is in some sense visible, not maybe fully in and by themselves, but through the medium of that which is beautiful. So feel free to go anywhere from what I've just said.
I'm not.
And people, don't forget to ask questions if you're just joining us now. Thomas is here a bit longer, and if you have questions, we'll get to them. And also, don't forget to enroll.
You know what's funny? I actually find that it's that kind. It's a right. There's that question, right? Basically, where are the forms, right? Like where the question of do these forms are entities? Are they entities?
Yeah.
It's the typical kind of question of what are universals? Are they just conceptions in the mind, nominalist, basically arguments? Are they actual entities that we participate with, right? Um, yeah. So definitely, there's and I purposely put Parmenides, one of the most difficult dialogues, in
Yeah.
this because I you got mad at me for trying to slip it in at the end, but we worked it through. I do agree it deserves its own discussion because
Yeah.
through this lens, but because the goal is through this investigation of the beautiful, when we read again Parmenides now, um, with this framing of the beautiful, we come to what you hinted at, what you're positing there is this realization that they're not this a far away thing, this like Gnostic other world that we have no contact with. Even that's exactly what's pointed out that one of the in Parmenides' presentation to the younger Plato, Socrates, as a character, he said, "Your argument, as you have it right now, would mean we're completely divorced from the absolute beautiful. We have no contact with it." But
Yeah.
the whole point is that no, what we do have encounters of the beautiful. We do. So thus, there must be a necessary connection it's not this kind of a far divorce. We're not divorced and stricken away from the striking of the most intelligible, highest part of reality. It's actually here
Yeah.
now with us, which gives a very empowering. I mean, I left when I my conclusion of the reading series was a kind of sense of hope. Actually, it's actually like you actually feel like it's funny because I've read some philosophical text where you kind of feel hopeless. It's kind of like we just been presented with just like by rationality, we've realized how irreducible things are failing. uh, but through reading these dialogues and the way I prepared it and read it through, I left with this great sense of hope of just like, yes, there's a great possibility in front of us. The journey's not complete. I even say that. I say like these dialogue, like, do we have a definitive answer at the end? I don't think we do. I think it definitely, but I do think we have a much better understanding than we did at the beginning of this investigation, of the circumscribing of what the beautiful is.
Yeah, and I'll say this again, as I said last time, the forms in the Parmenides dialogue are described. Wouldn't it be wonderful um, if the forms were not mutable, but if they um, could be uh, brought together? And I think that this is how, of course, Aristotle continues the project. And and in Plato, for some reason, the way in which the Aidai, the ideas, show themselves are in his myths. So in the stories that he tells, that's where the forms, to use that traditional language, that's where they body forth. It is actually, this is, think about Plato. Plato isn't the hyper rationalist philosopher he sometimes was made out to be, especially in 19th century.
Yes.
Very often German reception of that time. Schleiermacher, for example, would be one case. That's not at all what's going on. He writes his own myths. He appropriates myths from his time and from before and rewrites them. The myth of Atlantis, for example. And
Well, Phaedrus too. That's the whole
yeah,
point. His argument, his presentation of the human soul, uses the chariot metaphor,
yeah.
basically imagery, to demonstrate that.
Or he also warns, by the way, of writing with the Thuth myth. That's
Yes, yes, that too. Yes, and Phaedrus as well.
he doesn't. This is fascinating. What he says is, you know, the incredible insight already in that into that technology of writing and what it could do to memory, how it would warp, change memory, etc. Because tooth, strange in English to have the two th's in there, but toit sounds much better. But anyways, tooth, I'll say, thinks or claims that he's invented something for memory, but as is pointed out to him, no, you've only created a tool for reminders and probably are now diminishing uh, the capacity of memory. But it actually ends on another note, which is that the real danger is now the production of doxosophoi, those only seemingly wise, because
Yes.
they can read up and read the information, um, but
The appearance of knowledge as opposed to the reality of it.
yes, and here perhaps, and good evening, Harris, by the way. Oh, thanks. And by the way, maybe you could, yeah. So maybe speak on how beauty relates to the reality of knowledge briefly, if you want.
Well, there's two parts of that. I mean, first of all, there's the general point. I talk about this in the dialogue that what we think of as the general concern with beauty of
Yeah.
the image presentation images, appearances versus reality, right? So that kind of tension point. I point out that that problem is existent with any of the other categories of truth or in goodness. The same problems appear. That it's the problem of when do we know the appearances correspond to the reality? Um, so that is assisted. I think that we see that a lot in Plato's dialogues. Is this constant a discussion about these tension points? Um, Now, what we just said, what we just discussed right here was this presentation of knowledge. So basically, access to
Yeah.
truth uh, being presented in a sense of appearances versus the actual possession of it. That if one just interacts with just writing or with just names, because there's a fascinating line at the end of Critias where it's like, oh, you don't actually even need to know the names to know the true reality of things. Um, these are just instruments to get access to them. So there's tension points kind of within these dialogues about even
Mm,
operation of truth, and then in goodness, basically with virtue, basically one articulation of it. Meno is a presentation of that. So there's a whole problem when it's asked, especially there's a tension point because it gets presented is virtue teachable, and that gets worked through to draw out that at least the way I do a reading from Aristotle about this, but what's called the moral virtues would appear to not be teachable because the argument made is that if you can teach technes, like basically wrestling and all the
yeah.
other crafts, but moral goodness can't be taught. What's going on here? Um, so thus that kind of operation of knowing by doing. So there's actually that's interesting kind of dynamic built into that, right? So that the activity of having knowledge is what gains power to do things. There's an interesting connection in that aspect. So in these dialogues, we see these thought processes and their tensions kind of built up through
Mm.
the different dialogues.
And the highest is, of course, theoria, pure seeing of the divine. Book 10, Nicomachean Ethics, ends on the strangest note. Here is our wonderful Harris. Harris, thank you so much for the super chat. Harris continues to be the first and only super chatter. So thank you again, Harris. Here's his question. Is it possible that Plato's exploration of inner beauty, virtue, and outer beauty, aesthetic beauty, in the symposium reveals deeper truths about the human experience and the interplay between ourselves and the external world?
Yes.
Excellent question. By the way, Harris is in the course, so these are the kinds of questions, folks, that we'll be discussing. So join us now. The link to enroll is in the description of this video.
Yes. Yeah. Can't wait to have him in part of the group. It's a great question. So the first thing is immediately this is the ladder of love, right? Articulated by Diotima in Symposium. So we start with the external beauty of first of all one body, then basically goes into basically more universal, basically abstractional body, the human body in general, right? And then its operation kind of continues through the presentation of Diotima's speech. And is generally through eventually into thought, into basically actions, then into thought, into laws, customs, working all the way up until one comes to see the beautiful, right? In the vast ocean of beauties. I think this is a great line in English translation. It's kind of ocean of beauties to see the one beauty that I think that language is actually very important, kind of tied with Phaedra's idea of like through at the end of one's toil and struggle, one comes to see the true beautiful and gains the science of the beautiful, basically not the images of the beauty, but realities of beauty. I always find that line. So basically that nourishes true virtue and becomes friends, basically the best chance of being a friend with God. These are very powerful statements. I mean, this is uh, I think definitely that's basically part of the argument is that part of the idea of how does one come to gain access to truth, to reality, when we're basically in shadows of doxa, images, appearances.
Yeah.
This is one of the argumentations is that Plato must present the beautiful as the instrument to do it. If you do not have the beautiful, there is no way to link the appearances, the images, and both in perception and an opinion to reality, to the highest form of reality. He needs this. This is a very core, essential part of the system to give the articulation. So I think Harris has done. This is an excellent presentation of that. Yeah, because inner beauty, because this now, that's a little bit. I would say that's a little bit about like. I think definitely that's an argument. I've seen Augustus talk about that, right?
Hmm.
Aquinas talk about inner beauty. So the idea, I quote this section from Aquinas in my introduction. The word honesty, honestinum. It's very fast. There's a section in the Summa about this, and it gets translated. You can translate the honesty. It's almost like this kind of you can kind of see the parallels of like we think that the beautiful is a kind of relationship to the authentic. So it's not just like true; it's the authentic. I can see developments in thought that link things together. It is this idea of the inner soul having beauty that is beyond physical appearances and is generally our moral character. So the idea of the moral virtues being articulated through that. Actually, in the theological traditions, a lot of times it's actually said that the only possession one has when they die in eternity is virtue. It's the only possession. So in Islamic tradition, is the idea of the gemstones of the soul. It's kind of which is very fun because that's actually a kind of riffing on Greater Hippias. There's this discussion at one point: is the beautiful that which is added to things? It fails, but it's a discussion about materials. So idea of like gold being the beautiful, or gemstones, or ivory. Kind of riff on a theological account later on. The idea is like the soul's enjeweled, it's
Hmm.
beautified by the possession of virtue. That's the one possession that we get to go to heaven with uh, in the afterlife. That's the kind of riffing point. So I'm just pointing out that I do think the idea of the inner beauty
Yeah.
beyond just thought, because that's explicitly stated in Diotimas, like the idea of great, beautiful notions, beautiful thoughts, beautiful customs. But that kind of inner beauty in terms of soul virtue, that's an articulation a little more developed later on, but it's definitely in harmony, I would say. So I do think it's a little bit. I'm just kind of riffing at this point a little bit.
Excellent response and excellent question. As I said, Harris is in the course, so this is what to expect. Here's Mills, who's also in the seminars. And as you mentioned, our translation, specific translation, just yourself. Um, so Mills is going through the materials already, and he asks, "I'm enjoying the material so far." Well, thank you very much. Is there a particular translator we should stick to, or conversely, any we should avoid? Now, we have to be careful if they're still alive and we tell people to avoid, and perhaps we get sued. So, but no, kidding. No, no. Mention who you. I always make a point when I think that translation is wrong. So you can say anything that you would like to say. Obviously.
Yeah, I'm generally pretty neutral. I'm mainly in the sense of what I do is a lot like, well, you'll see in my essay series, I'm very systematic. Actually, I appreciate. I was really honored when Johannes said that to me. It's like very systematic. Really appreciate your system approach to the writing on this. Uh, like
Yeah,
I basically I use the Tufts website, uh,
yeah.
basically
These
where
are great
Greek.
translations. Yeah,
I have the Greek with the English, so I work with that a
yeah.
lot. And I usually iron out. I usually get to the Greek, and I usually use that. So I make references to that um, in my lecture series notes about it. So I'm generally pretty neutral um, as long as you basically keep an eye out for the Greek that's being used and how it's being translated. I would say, especially in very important areas. I think it's more about when you're starting to see translations that completely obfuscate. I don't have much an opinion about that, but I think it's key when in doubt, go read the Greek or go check it out just to see if the terms are repeating or if there's things that don't make any that are kind of thrown in there.
Yeah.
This is general riffing in my point. But I just to give context, like what I'm using from my work is the Tufts translation, um, which is from open source, is publicly available. Uh, it's a translation by the Fowler. It's a Fowler translation. That's what I'm using.
In general, often older translations have sometimes, especially from Britain, have sometimes a tendency, or as Americans have a tendency to import Christian language. That can happen. Obviously, that's not really there in Plato. So, uh, who's really great to read in general is the editor of the Oxford edition of the collected works of Plato, John Burnett. I can highly recommend all of his books, be it early Greek philosophy or from Thales to Plato. They should be they should be part of any good library. I've got uh, so this one here, for example, you can find wherever you find used books, and you probably pay $2 or $3 or euros or pounds for it. So in general, he was also the editor. I think the Loeb, if you can, if you want to spend the money, the Loeb are great because the you get the original Greek on the left and the translation on the right. If you know a bit of Greek, you know where they go astray or where they make it too easy for themselves. Um, that can happen with the Loeb. If you're German, then I recommend obviously the Reklam editions because they're very affordable. The translations are very good. Also, the Greek text included, and lots of footnotes on translations that are difficult or impossible. There are passages that cannot be translated. We don't have the equivalent in the grammar. We can't. We don't even know maybe the words all too well. So that can happen. So yeah, Tufts is great, but get your hands on some physical copies as well. By the way, there's a translation of Plato's Symposium that I only just recently found out about by Percy Shelley um, on Plato's Symposium. So that there was PDFs of this abundant on the so-called internet that you may have heard of. So yeah, Tufts is really a great source because you have the text. You can look up the Greek words and you can find out, especially with the more difficult forms, what kind of form it is, how it's usually translated, how it's translated in other contexts, etc. So that's but in general, I would also just agree with Thomas. Find the translation of the text that appeals the most to you when you read it, especially when you're still completely maybe unfamiliar with Plato. Um, but by the way, this I would say, if you're totally unfamiliar with Plato, you should still come if you have an interest in Plato or philosophy in general, because this is one of the best ways of introducing you, of leading you into, which is what introducere means after all, of leading you into philosophical thought. It's not too speculative or abstract because we're still discussing what is beautiful in a human being, what is beautiful in a work of art, what is beautiful in architecture, etc. But we're already looking towards the more speculative, dialectical um, aspects of and dimensions of Platonic thought. And given that Thomas has put together this course that begins with the Greater Hippias and continues with the Symposium, goes to the Phaedrus, then to the Meno, and the Cratylus and Parmenides, we are browsing through some of the most important dialogues, tying it to the question of virtue, but most importantly, I would say to the so-called theory of forms, to the ideas. Ending on the Parmenides is crucial. The Parmenides is a dialogue that no one has heard of and that no one ever reads. It's a dialogue where Plato explicates the one and the many. It's where he, in my uh, humble view, he basically does say to us that the forms are in the midst of where we are. They are principles, and they are hence um, there is a noetic dimension to them. He is, after all, the idealist above all. But Plato, by the way, is also very aware of the gigantic battle of being, gigantomachia perites ousias, as he points out in the sophist dialogue, so the oldest battle between realism and a simplistic idealism. You cannot, obviously, Plato is not a realist in the sense that real things come first, entities here, or not a pure idealist either. He's on a higher level of reflection, I think. So, and by the way, this is what Heidegger explicitly refers back to in the very first paragraph of Being in Time. It's the Gigantomachia perites ousias, which, as Heidegger says, kept alive and awake the thinking of Plato and Aristotle. And the mistake is always to turn something into a tradition and make it a sterile, functional or enterprise that is proto-ideological, basically. But instead, we break open these texts. We try to translate words in a weird way, perhaps, and you'll see that Thomas has done a great job doing this with this course. So again, congratulations on the good work over these past couple of years. After um, after trying to do everything, we now focus in aesthetics. What is possible? Maybe in a future course, more modern thinkers that have something to say, like Hume and Kant and others. Um, but we begin with Plato. So if you have more questions for Thomas, we'll be here only a couple more minutes. So let us know now. Thank you very much, Harris. Also, Harris says great insights. Thank you very much, Harris. I have to thank you for always being here and asking great questions. The link to enroll is in the description of this video. If there are more questions, let us know now. Thomas, the floor is yours. Any closing remarks, invitation, etc.?
Yeah, I would say in general, it's the quality of the course, right? The quality of these questions. I think it's the rewarding part of being in a room with like the people interested in these kind of questions are going to be such an enriching experience. I think in both the participants' live like experience as well as me. I'm excited to teach this course. I'm very excited to have the pro seminar and the conference at the end to see what comes forth.
Yeah.
And I think actually, kind of riffing on what are the signs of the beautiful, we see one of my kind of more, I would say, inventive approaches in the lecture series is the discussion of the coming to be, the ginomai, the kind of revelational newness of beauty having that kind of quality to it, of things that appear that basically reveal themselves out of what it seems to be a nothing, coming to be that has a revolution that kind of has a revelational quality to it. Uh, I find that discussion or those properties are in the dialogues we talk about, and I find that very, very just again, I'm like enamored. I'm in love with this idea, with this whole project, and as you said, like, the project could be much further beyond forget even going to human Kant, for example. Um, I know there are lots of other Platonic dialogues that I had to omit just because I need to keep this tight to some degree. And I know on top of my mind, and I close on this in the end of the discussion of my lecture series, is the idea of measure, which has a very direct correlation with virtue in Aristotle's accounts. So that I already know where my project of investigation needs to go next. But in the meantime, this initial discussion of like what is the beautiful and what is implications for us, both in terms of how we live our lives, how to relate to ourselves, how to relate to others, and even just the groundwork of the possibility. Kind of use a Kanti mode. The groundwork of the possibility for access to truth, to access to reality in the first place. Um,
Yeah.
you walk away, I think, from a very kind of a, almost development reading through these dialogues in this way. It's almost like, as you said, like you close. My choice to go to Parmenides at the end is the choice. It was a preparation to prepare one's mind, as you said, for someone who may not have any philosophical training. Because remember, I don't come from my training in philosophy is much later. My initial training was in
Yeah.
the arts.
Yeah.
So for someone, I wrote this course with that in mind. That I was writing this for the thinking of artists or people who just love beauty in general but
Yeah.
have a confused understanding about it. We're aware of it, we know of it, but when we actually, just like hippies, we're asked to say, "Give me what is the beautiful, give me that definition."
Mm.
We're left that kind of aporia, like I don't know if you. I mean, you're pushing a demand on me I cannot answer right now. Um, I wrote this course and structured the course to develop those kinds of individuals who have that similar position to kind of come with a better understanding, a more articulated understanding of what is the nature of the beautiful by the end, so that we can approach this one of the most demanding dialogues with new eyes.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Thomas. I'll point it out again that enrollment is now open. The link to enroll is in the description of this either podcast or video, depending where you're listening to this, because this will be up on my Substack afterwards as well. All materials have been uploaded, so you can start, once you are enrolled, you can start listening and reading. The seminars, if you have time for them, begin on Saturday, July the 27th. They continue for 5 consecutive weeks with the final session on August 24th. So a brisk walk through Plato in summer, if that's, I hope, how you'd like to spend your summer. 2 hours each, 6 to 8 p.m. UK time, 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That means if you're on the West Coast, then you should also be able to join us if you're in America, but also other people from experience have joined us, South Africa, Mexico, Latin America, more broadly speaking, etc. So the Philosophical Fellowship, that's the live seminars led by Thomas Jockin. There will be 5 seminars in total. At the final seminar, the conference, you get to present your own talk, essay, poem, song, whatever it may be. If you don't have time for at least 3 seminars, and be aware that we do record all seminars. So if you can't make it to 1 or 2 of them, that's fine. You just listen back to the recording. And yes, you're not participating directly, but you still know where the discussion has gone. And you can, if you want to if you have a follow-up question, you just ask Thomas in the next session. But if you don't have time and you'd still like to learn about beauty, take the self-study. You learn at your own pace. You have what the marketing people call indefinite access or lifetime access. That means you sign up once and you're in it forevermore until either Judgment Day or Teachable go bankrupt. But that's, what's the difference? So, and uh, in a way, though, the internet is an Alexandrian library. That's for another time to discuss. So do buy physical copies of all books. Don't rely on Tufts too much, I sometimes fear. But apart from that, if if you have a project, perhaps you're engaging. So usually the people who take the philosophical dialogues, the extra 5 private tutorials with our teachers, they usually are very creative themselves. Maybe they're working on Substack publications, or they have their own podcasts, or they're playwrights, or professors of mathematics. That has happened, or they are in business, and they, you think you could benefit from discussing beauty, Plato, and Aristotle. As you can hear, Thomas knows a lot about Aristotle, but also is himself a businessman. He's had a startup. He's a lecturer, so a Renaissance man for the 21st century.
I suppose.
Yeah. So if you think that you could benefit from extra 5 private sessions, an hour each, also over Zoom, that Thomas will set up with you over the course of the 5 weeks, then do sign up for the philosophical dialogues and support the work that we do here in this way. If you know anyone interested in Plato, in philosophy, who maybe has already read a lot of Plato and would like to continue, or is completely new to philosophy and wants to get started somewhere, because a question that we often get is, how do I start? Where do I start? And it's like swimming. How do you start swimming? I don't know.
You
Someone
gotta jump
throws
in.
you. Yeah, someone throws you in. There's not much else you can do.
But with that said, I mean, as Plato says in Phaedrus, it's the beautiful is the most benevolent of things to be seen. If basically if we saw justice immediately at first, we'd be destroyed by that power. But beauty is graceful, never suffers violence, but never causes violence. That I
Yeah.
want to riff on those points.
That's one of the strongest moments in your lectures, is when you discuss that how significant it is for Plato, or for philosophy, that we are mortal finite beings that are still touched by and addressed by the infinite and the eternal.
Yes.
That that I- that's in itself beautiful. So and because we are wrestling always, as Montaigne said, with the view to Socrates and Plato, to philosophize means to learn to die, uh, and that doesn't mean, oh, we're decrepit, and I'm lying on my deathbed. It means how to live well, and how you live well when you have your own finitude in all aspects in view and in mind. So we hope that you may join us all very soon. 4 weeks until exactly 4 weeks actually until the course begins, July 27th. Until then, I wish you all and everyone the best. Have a wonderful July. To my American friends, have a wonderful 4th of July. I know it's a difficult time for you
Got
and
fireworks,
everyone.
got ready to go, get the barbecue ready. It's gonna be a great time.
There's a poem by Goethe which the first line is, "America, you've got it better." So, and he was serious. He was dead serious. He was because he thought that Europe was weighed down by all of this baggage from ghost stories and all that kinds of superstitions, etc. So, yes, uh, Thomas, you have the final word. To everyone else, I hope to see you at the course.
I think the key part is that a good foundation builds everything up. If I had to summarize the point, I say that because your line about the interaction of the beautiful with our finitude,
Yeah.
right, a finite being with the infinite. I'm reminded instantly from Achilles, where there's a line about he made everything beautiful in its time. He also put infinity in the heart, eternity in the hearts of men. Uh, so I think that's a very powerful reminder that these lines of thought from Plato on the nature of the beautiful it's been with us this whole time. It's basically it's been with us without us being aware of it. And one of the joys of this philosophical project of talking about the beautiful was realizing it's almost like a beloved that's been with you this whole time that you never knew was there.
Yeah. Anamnesis. We always, nothing is ever given. Plato already knew this. We always have to rest it free and remember, recollect. Thank you so much, Thomas. We've taken a lot of your time, almost a full 2 hours. That will be the length of the seminars. But and thank you all, everyone, for these wonderful questions. If there are any questions after, just leave a comment, and I'll try and respond to them as quickly as I can, and as well as I can. Okay, so